7-year-old Sophie Matthews found her daddy crying in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. The stack of medical bills scattered across their small wooden table told a story of desperation that no child should ever have to witness. But there was Sophie, clutching her worn teddy bear against her Disney princess pajamas, watching tears stream down Daniel Matthews' weathered face. "Daddy, are we going to be homeless?" The question hung in the air like a prayer whispered in the dark. Daniel's calloused hands trembled as he quickly wiped his eyes, trying to shield his daughter from the crushing weight of their reality. At 38, he'd thought he had life figured out. A steady job in construction, a loving wife, a beautiful daughter, and a modest rental house that had become their sanctuary. But that was before the cancer came for Sarah. Before 18 months of treatments, experimental drugs, and hospital stays that cost more than he made in 2 years. Before the funeral that emptied what little savings they had left. "No, sweetheart." Daniel managed his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "Daddy's just thinking about some grown-up stuff." Sophie padded across the linoleum floor in her fuzzy slippers, the ones Sarah had bought her for Christmas last year. The sight of them made Daniel's chest tighten. Everything in their small house carried Sarah's fingerprints, her love, her absence. "Mommy used to say thinking too hard gives you wrinkles," Sophie observed with the innocent wisdom only children possess. "Maybe you should stop thinking so much. If only it were that simple." The eviction notice crumpled in Daniel's back pocket gave him 72 hours to come up with $3,200, or lose the only home Sophie had ever known. The medical debt from Sarah's treatment had swallowed every dollar he could scrape together, and the collection calls had started coming daily. Daniel knelt down to Sophie's level, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You know what? You're absolutely right. How about we make some pancakes before school?" Sophie's face lit up like Christmas morning. "The funny-shaped ones." "The funny-shaped ones," Daniel confirmed, grateful for the distraction. As Sophie chatted about her upcoming spelling test and whether Mrs. Johnson would let them have extra recess, Daniel moved through the motions of breakfast preparation. But his mind was elsewhere, calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up to enough. He'd already picked up every extra shift the construction company would give him. He'd sold Sarah's jewelry, her car, everything of value except the ring he couldn't bear to part with. The pancake batter sizzled in their old pan, and Sophie giggled as Daniel attempted to make one that looked like a butterfly. It ended up resembling something closer to a blob with wings, but Sophie declared it perfect anyway. "Daddy, how come we can't buy the cereal with the prize inside anymore?" Sophie asked between bites, her question innocent, but cutting straight to Daniel's heart. He'd hoped she hadn't noticed the way he'd been buying the generic brand skipping items that used to fill their cart, making meals stretch longer than they should. 7-year-olds noticed everything, especially when their world was quietly shifting beneath their feet. "Well, sometimes we have to make smart choices about money," Daniel explained carefully. "It's like when you save your allowance for something special." Sophie nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation the way children do when they trust their parents completely. That trust felt like a weight on Daniel's shoulders, heavier than any construction beam he'd ever carried. After breakfast, as Daniel helped Sophie gather her school supplies, he noticed the holes worn through the toes of her sneakers. New shoes would have to wait. Everything would have to wait until he figured out how to keep their home. Walking Sophie to the school bus stop, Daniel waved goodbye with a smile that cracked the moment she was out of sight. The autumn air in their small Ohio town carried the promise of winter, and winter meant higher heating bills he couldn't afford. Back in the empty house, Daniel stood in Sarah's craft room, surrounded by her art supplies, her unfinished paintings, the sewing machine she'd used to make Sophie's Halloween costumes. This room held so much love, so many memories. But love wouldn't pay the rent. His phone buzzed with another call from the collection agency. Daniel let it go to voicemail like he had for the past week. He knew what they wanted, and he knew he didn't have it. The eviction notice felt like sandpaper between his fingers as he unfolded it again. 72 hours. The numbers blurred through his tears, but the deadline remained crystal clear. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. That's when Daniel made the decision that would save them all, though he didn't know it yet. He would have to rent out Sarah's room. The craft room had been Sarah's sanctuary. Watercolor paintings lined the walls, some finished, others abandoned mid-stroke, when fatigue from chemotherapy made holding a brush impossible. Her easel still stood in the corner, a half-completed landscape of the lake, where they'd had their first date frozen in time. Daniel stood in the doorway, his work boots refusing to cross the threshold. For 18 months since Sarah's death, this room had remained untouched, a shrine to the woman who'd filled their house with laughter and their daughter with unconditional love. The thought of a stranger sleeping where Sarah used to paint felt like the final betrayal. But Sophie's trusting face flashed in his mind, the way she'd accepted his explanation about smart money choices without question. She deserved better than a father who let pride destroy their security. "I'm sorry, baby," Daniel whispered to the empty room, to Sarah's memory, to the life they'd planned that would never be. He'd picked up a double shift that day, installing drywall in a new office complex downtown. The physical labor felt good, familiar, something he could control. But even working overtime, even with the occasional weekend job, the math didn't work. Sarah's medical bills had created a mountain of debt that his construction wages couldn't climb. The other guys on the crew talked about their wives, their weekend plans, their kids' soccer games. Daniel listened and smiled, but he felt like he was watching life through a window, separate from the easy normalcy they took for granted. His supervisor, Mike Rodriguez, pulled him aside during lunch break. "You okay, Matthews? You've been looking rough lately." Daniel appreciated Mike's concern, but pride kept his mouth shut. "Just tired. Sophie had me up late with a project." Mike studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that said he wasn't buying the excuse. "You know, if you need anything, right? Sometimes us single dads gotta stick together." Mike had been raising his teenage son alone for 5 years, ever since his wife left for Arizona with her yoga instructor. The offer was genuine, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to admit how desperate things had become. That evening, after Sophie finished her homework at their small kitchen table, she looked up with those bright blue eyes that mirrored her mother's. "Daddy, can we go see Mommy this weekend?" They visited Sarah's grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers when Daniel could afford them, plastic ones when he couldn't. Sophie would sit cross-legged on the grass and tell her mother about school, about her friends, about the books she was reading. "Of course, sweetheart. What should we tell her this week?" Sophie considered this seriously. "I want to tell her about the story I wrote. Mrs. Johnson said it was really good. It's about a princess who saves a dragon instead of the other way around. Sarah would have loved that story. She'd always encouraged Sophie's creativity, her tendency to see the world differently than everyone else." "Mommy would be so proud of you," Daniel said, his throat tight. After tucking Sophie into bed with a story about brave princesses and misunderstood dragons, Daniel returned to Sarah's craft room. He'd been putting off this moment all day, but the eviction notice wouldn't wait for his grief to catch up. Slowly, carefully, he began packing away Sarah's art supplies. Each item carried a memory, the brush set he'd given her for their anniversary. The palette knife she'd used to create texture in her landscapes, the half-empty tubes of paint in colors with names like cerulean blue and burnt sienna. Sophie appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, having escaped from her bedroom with the stealth that only 7-year-olds possess. "What are you doing?" "Daddy." Daniel's hands stilled on a box of pastels. How could he explain this without breaking his daughter's heart, without admitting that they were one step away from losing everything? "I'm just organizing Mommy's things," he said carefully. Sophie stepped into the room, her small fingers trailing over the edge of Sarah's easel. Mommy would want someone else to be happy in here, right, Daddy? She always said sharing made everything better. The wisdom in those words, the echo of Sarah's generous spirit speaking through their daughter, nearly brought Daniel to his knees. How had he raised such a remarkable child? How had Sarah managed to instill such kindness even in the face of her own mortality? You're right, sweetheart. Mommy would want that. Sophie helped him pack the rest of the supplies. Her small hands careful with her mother's treasures, they found a letter Sarah had started writing addressed to Sophie for her 16th birthday. Daniel tucked it away quickly, his heart breaking at the realization that Sarah had been trying to be present for all the moments she'd miss. When the room was finally cleared, it looked different. Smaller somehow, but also full of possibility. Daniel could picture a desk by the window, a bed where the easel used to stand. Someone finding comfort in this space that had meant so much to his family. It's going to be okay, Daddy, Sophie said, slipping her small hand into his. Mommy's watching over us. She won't let anything bad happen. Daniel squeezed her hand, wishing he had his daughter's faith, her certainty that love could conquer practical realities like eviction notices and medical debt. The next morning, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen, trying to find the words that would save them. The handwriting that emerged was shakier than usual, evidence of the desperation he was trying to hide. Room for rent, he wrote. Quiet neighborhood, responsible tenant preferred. Call Daniel. He added his phone number and stared at the notice for a long moment. This felt like giving up, like admitting defeat. But Sophie's voice echoed in his mind. Mommy would want someone else to be happy in here. Maybe this wasn't giving up. Maybe this was what courage looked like when you had no other choice. 20-year-old Catherine Kate Harrison pressed her face against the bulletproof glass of her father's limousine, watching college students walk freely across the campus quad. They carried backpacks instead of designer purses, wore jeans with actual holes instead of strategically placed designer distressing, and laughed with friends whose last names weren't in Forbes magazine. Miss Harrison, your father expects you back at the estate by 4, the driver, James, said through the intercom. You have a dress fitting for the Morrison Charity Gala. Kate closed her eyes, fighting the familiar wave of suffocation that accompanied any mention of her scheduled life. Every minute of every day had been planned since birth by William Harrison, billionaire real estate developer and controlling father extraordinaire. Wake up at 6 for personal training, breakfast at 7:30 with the nutritionist's approved meal plan. Classes at the private college, where her father served on the board of trustees, ensuring her professors knew exactly who was paying their salaries. The Morrison Charity Gala wasn't about charity at all. It was about parading her in front of James Morrison Jr., the son of her father's business partner, and her intended future husband according to a plan she'd had no part in creating. James, can you drive around campus one more time? Kate asked, delaying the inevitable return to her gilded cage. Through the tinted windows she watched a group of girls her age sitting on the library steps sharing a bag of potato chips and giggling over something on one of their phones. The simplicity of the moment, the genuine joy on their faces made her chest ache with longing. Her own phone buzzed with a text from her father, Morrison Jr., will be joining us for dinner tonight. Wear the blue Valentino dress. Your future depends on making a good impression. Kate's future. As if she had any say in it. The Harrison estate sprawled across 47 acres in the most exclusive part of town, complete with security gates, surveillance cameras, and staff who reported her every move back to her father. Kate had never walked to a corner store, never taken public transportation, never had a conversation that wasn't monitored by someone on her father's payroll. Miss Kate, your father is waiting in his study. Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, informed her as she entered the marble foyer. The study smelled like leather and expensive cigars, the walls lined with first-edition books that William Harrison had purchased for show, rather than reading. He stood behind his massive mahogany desk, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit custom-tailored to hide the slight softness that came with wealth and age. "Catherine, we need to discuss your behavior at the Morrison dinner last week," he began without preamble. "James Jr. mentioned that you seemed distracted." Kate had been distracted wondering what it would be like to have a conversation about something other than stock portfolios and charity tax write-offs. James Morrison Jr. was handsome enough, educated at the right schools, born into the right family. He was also about as interesting as watching paint dry and twice as entitled. "I was paying attention, Father. Not the kind of attention that secures a future merger between our families," William said, his voice carrying the steel that had built his empire. "James Jr. is an excellent match. Intelligent, well-connected, and genuinely interested in you." Kate doubted that James Jr. was interested in her as anything more than a pretty accessory who came with a substantial dowry and family connections. But pointing that out would only trigger one of her father's lectures about duty responsibility and the sacrifices required to maintain their family's position. "I understand, Father." "Good. Because I've already discussed engagement timelines with Richard Morrison. A Christmas announcement would be ideal for both families." The words hit Kate like a physical blow. An engagement announcement. Her engagement decided without her input, scheduled for maximum social impact. That evening, dressed in the blue Valentino gown that cost more than most people made in a month, Kate sat through dinner with the Morrisons, smiling at appropriate moments and nodding when James Jr. talked about his plans to expand his father's pharmaceutical company into overseas markets. "Kate would be a tremendous asset to your endeavors," William said, speaking about her as if she weren't sitting right there. "She speaks 4 languages and has excellent social connections throughout Europe." Kate felt like a prize horse being auctioned to the highest bidder. Her accomplishments, her education, even her language skills were just bullet points on a resume designed to make her more marketable to potential husbands. Later that night, alone in her bedroom suite that was larger than most apartments, Kate stood at her window overlooking the manicured gardens. Security lights illuminated every corner of the property, ensuring that privacy was an illusion even in her own home. Her laptop sat open on her antique writing desk, the screen displaying the college website where she'd been browsing student housing options for months. Not because she planned to move out, but because she liked to imagine what freedom might look like. That's when she saw it. A simple post on the community board, "Room for rent." Quiet neighborhood. Responsible tenant preferred. "Call Daniel." Something about the straightforward honesty of the posting called to her. No mention of credit checks, family references, or security deposits that would require her father's approval. Just a room offered by someone named Daniel in what she imagined was a real neighborhood where real people lived real lives. Kate stared at the phone number for a long moment, her heart hammering with a possibility she'd never allowed herself to consider. What would happen if she just disappeared? If she walked away from the engagement announcement, the charity galas, the carefully controlled life that felt more like a beautiful prison with each passing day? Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. She'd never made a call without someone listening in, never made a decision without her father's approval, never acted on her own desires without considering the consequences for the Harrison family reputation. But something about the simple honesty of that posting, the ordinariness of a man named Daniel offering a room in his home, gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. Before she could change her mind, Kate dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times before a deep, tired voice answered. "Hello." Kate's throat went dry. In all her practice conversations, she hadn't considered how different her voice would sound to someone who didn't know she was the daughter of William Harrison. Her accent, polished by years of private tutors and elocution lessons, would mark her immediately as someone who didn't belong in a world where people rented rooms from strangers. "Hi, I saw your notice about the room for rent. Is it still available?" There was a pause long enough to make Kate wonder if she'd made a mistake. In the background, she could hear the faint sound of a television. A child's voice asking about homework, the ordinary sounds of a family evening that she'd never experienced. "Yeah, it's still available. You sound young. You a college student?" "Yes, I am. I'm looking for somewhere quiet to study. Something affordable." Another pause. Kate held her breath, realizing that this phone call represented more than finding a place to live. It was her first real conversation with someone who knew nothing about her father, her family, or the expectations that had shaped every moment of her life. "You can come by today if you'd like. Take a look, see if it works for you." Kate's heart raced with excitement and terror in equal measure. "That would be wonderful. What's the address?" The address Daniel gave her was in a part of town she'd never seen, despite living in the same city her entire life. Kate's world consisted of the estate, the country club, the private college campus, and the upscale shopping districts where her father's security detail could blend in with the wealthy clientele. After hanging up, Kate stared at her reflection in the antique mirror above her dressing table. The girl looking back at her wore a silk nightgown that cost more than some people's monthly salary, her blonde hair styled by a personal hairdresser who came to the estate twice a week. Her skin perfect thanks to expensive skincare treatments. How could she possibly convince this Daniel person that she was just a regular college student looking for an affordable room? The next afternoon, Kate dismissed her driver and security detail with a carefully crafted story about studying at the library with friends. Instead, she took a taxi her first time in a cab, marveling at the worn seats and the driver's casual conversation about the weather. The Carter house stood at the end of a narrow lane tucked between two tall hedges that needed trimming. The yard was small, but well-maintained, with children's chalk drawings still visible on the sidewalk, and a bicycle with training wheels leaning against the front porch. Kate hesitated outside her designer purse, feeling suddenly inappropriate, her clothes marking her as someone who clearly didn't belong. But before she could change her mind, the front door opened. Daniel Matthews appeared in the doorway, and Kate's first thought was that he looked exactly like what she'd imagined when she heard his voice. His dark hair was slightly unkempt, his flannel shirt rolled up to reveal forearms marked by years of physical work, and his eyes held a cautious kindness that spoke of someone who'd learned to be careful about trust. "You're Kate?" he asked, sizing her up in a moment. Not in judgment, she realized, but in the careful way of a father who always thought about safety first. She nodded suddenly, unable to speak. Before Daniel could continue, a small figure peeked out from behind his legs. Big, curious eyes, messy brown pigtails, and arms wrapped around a stuffed rabbit that had clearly been well loved for years. "Is she the one, Daddy?" The little girl whispered loudly enough for Kate to hear every word. Daniel's expression softened as he looked down at his daughter. "This is Sophie. She'll be around a lot. If that's a problem." "It's not," Kate interrupted, surprising herself with the speed of her response. Something about the little girl's direct gaze and innocent curiosity bypassed all of Kate's carefully constructed social armor. She knelt down to Sophie's eye level, ignoring the fact that her expensive jeans would probably be grass-stained from the gesture. "Hi there, I'm Kate." Sophie studied her for a long moment with the intense concentration only children possess when evaluating new adults. Kate found herself holding her breath, waiting for a verdict from someone who couldn't have been older than 7. Finally, Sophie smiled, a bright, gap-toothed grin that transformed her entire face. "You can stay. You look nice. And you have kind eyes like Mommy did." The simplicity of the declaration, the innocent acceptance, hit Kate harder than any business negotiation or charity board presentation ever had. When was the last time someone had judged her character rather than her bank account? Daniel cleared his throat, clearly moved by his daughter's immediate approval. "Well, that's settled then. Sophie's the real decision-maker around here anyway." As he led Kate through the small house, she marveled at the warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. Family photos covered every available surface, showing a progression from wedding pictures to baby photos to recent school portraits. The furniture was worn but comfortable, the kind of pieces that had been chosen for durability rather than style. "This was my wife's craft room," Daniel explained as they reached the upstairs space. "She passed away 18 months ago. Cancer." The room was modest but clean, with a small window overlooking the street and walls that still held the faint scent of oil paints and creativity. Kate could picture the easel that must have stood in the corner, the art supplies that would have filled the shelves, the love that had filled this space. "I'm sorry for your loss," Kate said softly, meaning every word. Daniel nodded, his jaw working slightly, as he fought emotions that were clearly still raw. "Sophie and I are doing okay. We've got our routine, our rules. Rent's due at the end of each month. I'll keep things fair, and if you need anything, just knock." Kate looked around the room, imagining what it would be like to wake up here every morning to be part of a real family's daily life, instead of floating through her father's carefully orchestrated existence. "Thank you. I think this will work perfectly." What she didn't tell Daniel was that she could have rented the most expensive penthouse in the city without thinking twice about the cost. What she couldn't explain was that her father would be furious when he discovered she'd disappeared from the estate without her security detail. Because for the first time in her life, Kate Harrison wasn't looking for luxury or status or safety. She was looking for something much more rare and precious, the chance to be valued for who she was rather than who her father expected her to become. And standing in that small room with the sound of Sophie's laughter drifting up from downstairs and Daniel's honest kindness filling the space between them, Kate realized she might have found exactly what she'd been searching for without even knowing she was looking. Kate's first morning in the Matthews house began at 6:30, with the unfamiliar sound of real life happening around her. No silent servants bringing perfectly prepared breakfast trays, no schedule handed to her by efficient assistants, just the ordinary chaos of a father getting his daughter ready for school. She'd spent her first night in the small room that had once belonged to someone's dreams, lying awake on sheets that smelled like fabric softener instead of the expensive lavender sachets her housekeeper tucked into her linens at the estate. Every sound was new, the house settling on its foundation, the neighbor's dog barking at the mailman, the gentle murmur of voices downstairs, as Daniel helped Sophie start her day. The smell of pancakes drew Kate from her room, following her nose toward the kitchen, where she found Sophie perched at the small table, her legs swinging, as she chatted about a spelling test, while Daniel flipped pancakes in a pan that had clearly seen better years. "Good morning," Kate said softly, suddenly uncertain about whether she was intruding on their private family time. Sophie's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Kate, Daddy Kate's here. Can she have pancakes too?" Daniel glanced up briefly from the stove, his expression carefully polite. "You don't have to come down, you know. Your portion has its own kitchenette upstairs. You're not obligated to join us for meals." The careful boundaries in his voice were clear, but Kate found herself stepping further into the kitchen anyway. "I thought maybe I could help." Help? Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You're a tenant, not a cook." Before Kate could respond, Sophie hopped off her chair with the boundless energy that only 7-year-olds possessed. "Can she help me with homework?" "Please, Daddy. You're really bad at math." Daniel's ears turned slightly pink. "I'm not bad at math. I just use different methods than they teach in school now." Kate laughed, the sound surprising her with its naturalness. "I used to think I was terrible at math, too." "What kind of homework is it?" "Addition and subtraction, but with borrowing." Sophie groaned dramatically, scrunching her nose. "It's so confusing. I bet we can figure it out together," Kate offered, already reaching for Sophie's backpack, where homework papers peeked out from the top. As she helped Sophie work through the problems, Kate marveled at how different this felt from the tutoring sessions of her own childhood. No pressure to perform perfectly, No emphasis on grades that would look good on college applications. Just a little girl who needed patient guidance to understand a concept that was giving her trouble. "You're really good at explaining things," Sophie declared after successfully completing a row of problems. "Way better than Daddy." "Hey now," Daniel protested, but Kate caught the smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he placed a plate of slightly misshapen pancakes in front of Sophie. "These look like clouds," Sophie announced, drowning them in syrup, with the enthusiasm of a child who didn't have to worry about nutrition labels or portion control. Kate watched the easy interaction between father and daughter, noting the way Daniel automatically cut Sophie's pancakes into manageable pieces, the way he poured her orange juice into a cup with a lid to prevent spills, the 1,000 small acts of care that spoke of practice and devotion. "Are you sure you don't want some?" Daniel asked Kate, gesturing toward the remaining pancakes. "I don't want to intrude on your morning routine." "You're not intruding," Sophie piped up. "Right, Daddy, Kate lives here now, so she's part of the family." The innocent declaration hung in the air, carrying more weight than Sophie could possibly understand. Kate felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion at the casual inclusion, the simple acceptance of her presence in their lives. Daniel's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "Sophie's right. You're welcome to join us any time." As Kate savored her first real homemade pancakes in years, she listened to Sophie's excited chatter about show and tell day and whether Mrs. Johnson would remember to let them have extra recess if the weather was nice. The conversation was ordinary, wonderfully normal, filled with the kinds of concerns that made up a real childhood. When Daniel walked Sophie to the bus stop, Kate insisted on cleaning up the breakfast dishes, marveling at the simple satisfaction of washing plates in sudsy water rather than leaving everything for staff to handle. She was still at the sink when Daniel returned, his hair damp from the morning mist. "You really don't have to do that," he said, but his tone held gratitude rather than protest. "I want to help. Besides, it feels good to be useful." Daniel studied her for a moment, clearly puzzled by something he couldn't quite articulate. Most college students aren't eager to wash dishes at 7 in the morning. Kate realized she'd revealed something about herself without meaning to, something that didn't fit with the image of a cash-strapped student looking for affordable housing. "My grandmother always said that idle hands make for a troubled mind." It wasn't entirely a lie. Her father's mother had believed in the value of purposeful activity, though the old woman's idea of useful work had involved organizing charity committees rather than washing breakfast dishes. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." That evening, as Kate sat in her small room attempting to focus on an art history assignment, her phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from her father's assistant. The messages had started polite, asking about her whereabouts, but had quickly escalated to thinly veiled panic about her safety and her father's growing anger. She turned off her phone without responding, choosing instead to listen to the sounds of family life happening below her room. Sophie's bath time complete with splashing and giggles, Daniel's patient voice reading a bedtime story, doing different voices for each character. The gentle thud of footsteps as he checked on his daughter one final time before settling in for his own evening. For the first time in her life, Kate fell asleep to the sound of a real home instead of the hollow silence of empty hallways and distant staff quarters. And despite the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring, despite the growing list of missed calls from the Harrison estate, she slept more peacefully than she had in years. Within a week of living with the Matthews family, Kate began to notice the careful choreography of poverty. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but revealed itself in the small details that someone from her background would never have thought to observe. Daniel packed the same peanut butter sandwich for lunch every day, but he made sure Sophie had variety in her school meals. He compared prices at the grocery store with the focus of someone solving a complex equation, choosing generic brands and calculating cost per ounce with mathematical precision. His work boots had been resoled twice evident from the slightly different colored stitching. and his truck required what seemed like daily negotiations to start reliably. Kate watched him count out exact change for Sophie's field trip. Permission slip his jaw tight with the stress of making sure every dollar was accounted for. She saw him quietly put back the coffee he'd reached for when Sophie asked if they could afford the name-brand cereal with the cartoon character on the box. Her expensive phone buzzed constantly with calls from Harrison Industries, from her father's assistant, from the private security firm tasked with monitoring her whereabouts. Kate had turned off location services and disabled every tracking feature she could find, but she knew it was only a matter of time before her father's resources located her. The thought of returning to her scheduled life, to engagement announcements and charity galas and conversations about stock portfolios, made her chest tight with panic. Here in this small house where every penny mattered, she'd found something her father's billions couldn't buy, a place where she was valued for her presence rather than her potential. On Saturday morning, Kate volunteered to go grocery shopping with Daniel and Sophie, claiming she needed to pick up some items for herself. The local supermarket was a revelation, filled with families making careful choices, children begging for treats their parents couldn't afford, teenagers working part-time jobs to help support their households. Kate watched Daniel add up prices in his head, his mental calculator more accurate than any app. When Sophie spotted the cereal with the prize inside, her face lit up with hope. "Daddy, please, it's not much more expensive than the regular kind." Daniel examined the price tag, and Kate could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. $3.49 versus $1.99. A difference of $1.50 that might as well have been $1 million when you were counting every penny. "Not this week, sweetheart. Maybe next time." Sophie's disappointment was brief but crushing to witness. She nodded with the practiced resignation of a child who'd learned not to ask for too much. Kate couldn't stand it. While Daniel was distracted by Sophie's questions about vegetables, she quietly added the special cereal to their cart, then casually mentioned at checkout that she had a student discount card that took a percentage off the total. "Student discounts don't usually apply to groceries," Daniel said, clearly suspicious. "This is a special program through the college," Kate improvised. "They partner with local businesses to help students and families in the community." It was a terrible lie, but Sophie's excitement over her prize-containing cereal made Daniel's skepticism irrelevant. Sometimes Kate was learning kindness required creative storytelling. That afternoon, while Sophie played in the backyard and Daniel worked on fixing a leaky faucet, Kate's phone rang with a call from her father's personal line. She let it go to voicemail, but the message that followed made her hands shake. "Catherine, this game ends now. You have 24 hours to return home voluntarily, or I'll have security collect you. Don't test me on this." The threat was real. Her father had the resources to track her down, the influence, to make problems disappear, the connections to ensure that her brief taste of freedom would end as quickly as it had begun. That evening, Kate found herself helping Sophie with homework at the kitchen table, while Daniel prepared what was clearly a carefully budgeted dinner. Spaghetti with marinara sauce, a small salad, garlic bread made from day-old rolls he'd gotten at a discount. "Kate, do you have any brothers or sisters?" Sophie asked while working through math problems. "No, it's just me." "That must be lonely." "I always wanted a sister." "Daddy says maybe someday, but I think he means when I'm older. Like really, really older." Kate glanced at Daniel, noting the way his shoulders tensed at his daughter's innocent comment. The subject of family of future possibilities clearly carried weight that a 7-year-old couldn't understand. "What about your parents?" Sophie continued with the relentless curiosity of childhood. "Do they live far away?" "My mother died when I was very young, and my father is busy with work." It wasn't technically a lie. Her mother had died in a car accident when Kate was 3, leaving her to be raised by a succession of nannies and boarding schools while her father built his empire. But the truth was far more complicated than Sophie's innocent questions could accommodate. "I'm sorry about your mom," Sophie said. with the solemn sympathy only children could deliver without awkwardness. Mine died too. But Daddy says she's watching over us from heaven, and sometimes I think she sends us people who need to be part of our family. The words hit Kate with unexpected force. She glanced at Daniel, who had gone very still at the stove, clearly moved by his daughter's wisdom. That's a beautiful way to think about it, Kate managed. After Sophie went to bed, Kate found Daniel on the small back porch nursing a cup of coffee and staring at the neighbor's garden. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, the promise of winter, in a way that felt cozy rather than threatening. Sophie said something interesting tonight, Kate ventured, settling into the plastic chair beside him. She's full of interesting observations. Sometimes I wonder where she gets them. She said your wife sends people who need to be part of your family. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around the coffee mug like it was providing necessary warmth. Sarah always believed that everything happens for a reason, that the universe has a way of putting people exactly where they need to be. Do you believe that I want to? Daniel admitted. It's easier than believing that good people die for no reason and bad things happen to families who don't deserve them. Kate thought about her own presence there, about the forces that had driven her from her father's mansion to this small porch where real conversations happened under the stars. Maybe Sophie was right. Maybe some connections were meant to happen, regardless of how impossible they seemed on paper. Have you ever had to choose between your family's expectations and your own happiness? Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose ourselves, even when it means disappointing people we love. Thank you, Kate said quietly, for letting me be here, for including me in your family even temporarily. Daniel studied her face in the porch light, and Kate wondered what he saw there. You fit somehow. Sophie took to you immediately, and she's usually shy with strangers. There's something about you that feels right. If only he knew how desperately she needed to hear those words, how starved she was for acceptance that had nothing to do with her last name or her inheritance. Kate smiled, fighting back tears that would require explanations she wasn't ready to give. I feel right here too. The crisis came on a rainy Thursday morning when Kate woke to the sound of Sophie crying. Not the normal fussing of a child who didn't want to go to school, but the deep, frightened sobs of someone in genuine distress. Kate pulled on her robe and hurried downstairs to find Daniel pacing the living room with Sophie in his arms. Her small face flushed with fever, her usually bright eyes glazed with illness. Her temperature is 103, Daniel said, his voice tight with the controlled panic only parents understood. I've given her children's acetaminophen, but it's not coming down. Kate's first instinct was to suggest calling their family physician, arranging for a house call, or driving immediately to the private medical facility where her father's insurance guaranteed immediate attention. But those weren't options for a construction worker whose medical coverage came with high deductibles and limitations that made every doctor visit a financial calculation. We should take her to urgent care, Kate suggested, noting the way Daniel's jaw tightened at the suggestion. It's $200 just to walk through the door, Daniel admitted, clearly hating that money was part of the equation when his daughter was sick. If it doesn't come down in the next hour, I'll figure something out. Kate's heart broke for this man who loved his daughter so desperately that he was timing her suffering against his bank account. In her world, money had never been a consideration when it came to healthcare. The idea that someone would have to weigh a child's fever against grocery money was almost impossible to comprehend. Let me help, Kate offered. I can stay with her while you go to work, monitor her temperature, make sure she stays hydrated. You don't understand, Daniel said, his frustration evident. If this is something serious, if she needs antibiotics or tests, I can't afford to miss work and pay medical bills at the same time. Sophie whimpered against her father's chest, and Kate saw the exact moment when Daniel's resolve cracked. His daughter's well-being would always trump financial concerns, no matter the consequences. I'm calling in sick, he decided. If she gets worse, we'll deal with the urgent care bill somehow. Kate spent the day learning what real caregiving looked like when you couldn't afford to delegate responsibility to others. She helped Daniel set up a rotation of cool washcloths, encouraged Sophie to take small sips of water and read story after story while the little girl dozed fitfully. Daniel never left Sophie's side, his construction-roughened hands gentle as he brushed her hair away from her feverish face. Kate watched him count out children's medicine with the precision of a pharmacist timing doses exactly as recommended. His entire world narrowed to the rhythm of his daughter's breathing. Around noon, Sophie's fever finally broke. Color returned to her cheeks, and she asked for juice with a voice that sounded more like herself. Daniel's relief was so profound that Kate saw tears in his eyes as he held his daughter close. "Thank you," he said to Kate, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have managed this without you." "Yes, you could have. You're an incredible father, Daniel. Sophie is lucky to have you." The words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. Kate realized this man who gave everything he had to his daughter's well-being rarely heard praise for his efforts. In her world, good parenting was often outsourced to nannies and boarding schools. Here it was a daily act of love performed without recognition or applause. That evening, after Sophie had eaten her first real meal all day and was sleeping peacefully in her own bed, Daniel and Kate sat in the living room sharing leftover soup. The crisis had created an intimacy between them, the kind of bond forged when people face uncertainty together. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said, setting down his bowl. Kate's stomach tightened with nervousness. "Of course. Who are you, really?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the small inconsistencies Kate hadn't realized she'd been revealing. Her expensive phone, her lack of financial stress, her educated speech patterns that spoke of private tutors rather than public schools. "I'm exactly who I said I am," Kate replied carefully. "A college student looking for somewhere to belong." "The belonging part, I believe," Daniel said. "But there's more to your story. Your clothes, the way you carry yourself, even the way you offered to help with Sophie's medical bills without blinking. Most college students can barely afford ramen noodles." Kate felt the weight of her deception pressing down on her chest. This man had opened his home to her, included her in his family's daily life, trusted her with his daughter's care. He deserved honesty, but honesty would end everything she'd found here. "My family has money," she admitted partially, "but that's not who I want to be anymore." It was the closest to the truth she could manage without revealing the full extent of her father's wealth and the circumstances that had driven her to his doorstep. Daniel studied her face for a long moment. "Running from something or toward something?" Kate countered. "Sometimes they're the same thing." He nodded slowly, seeming to understand the distinction. "As long as you're not putting Sophie in any danger, as long as your running doesn't bring trouble to our doorstep." "I would never do anything to hurt Sophie. Or you." I believe that Daniel said, and the simple trust in his voice nearly undid her. "But secrets have a way of catching up with people, Kate. When they do, I need to know that Sophie and I won't get caught in the crossfire." Kate wanted to promise him that her past would never touch their peaceful life, but her phone had been buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from her father's staff. Soon her 24 hours would be up, and William Harrison's patience would run out entirely. "I understand," she said quietly, hoping she could keep the promise implied in those words. That night, as Kate lay in the small room that had become her sanctuary, she listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Daniel checking on Sophie one final time, the whisper of his footsteps as he prepared for another early morning of construction work, the ordinary rhythms of a family at peace. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether to return to her father's world voluntarily or force him to take more drastic measures to reclaim his wayward daughter. But tonight, in this small room where someone's dreams had once taken shape on canvas, Kate allowed herself to believe that belonging was possible even for a runaway billionaire's daughter who'd found her heart in the most unexpected place. 3 weeks into her stay at the Matthews house, Kate had developed a routine that felt more natural than any schedule her father's assistants had ever created for her. She woke each morning to the sound of Daniel's alarm at 6, followed by the gentle murmur of his voice coaxing Sophie from sleep. Breakfast happened around the small kitchen table with Kate helping pack Sophie's lunch, while Daniel checked the weather and planned his workday. The evenings had become Kate's favorite time. Daniel often worked late, picking up overtime hours to help cover their mounting bills, which meant Kate was there when Sophie got home from school. They'd established a homework routine at the kitchen table, with Kate patiently explaining math concepts while Sophie worked through reading assignments aloud. "You're getting really good at these word problems," Kate encouraged, watching Sophie tackle a story about sharing cookies between friends. "It's easier when you explain it," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "You make it sound like a story instead of just numbers." Kate had never considered herself particularly good with children, but Sophie's enthusiasm and trust had awakened something protective and nurturing that surprised her. There was something pure about a 7-year-old's perspective, unfiltered by the social calculations and hidden agendas that dominated her father's world. When Daniel finally came home, usually around 7, with dust on his work clothes and exhaustion in his eyes, he'd find them curled together on the couch, reading or working on Sophie's latest art project. The gratitude in his expression made Kate's chest tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. "You don't have to stay with her every afternoon," Daniel had said one evening, clearly feeling guilty about the additional responsibility Kate had taken on. "I want to," Kate replied honestly. "She's good company." What she couldn't explain was how much those afternoon hours meant to her. Sophie's innocent chatter about her friends, her teachers, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian who specialized in helping injured rabbits filled a silence in Kate's life she hadn't known existed. The neighbors had begun to accept Kate as part of the Matthews family routine. Mrs. Chen from next door brought over vegetables from her garden, including Kate, in her friendly warnings about the upcoming winter weather. The mailman knew to leave packages with Kate if Daniel wasn't home, and Sophie's school had added Kate's number as an emergency contact without anyone questioning the arrangement. It was the closest thing to normal family life Kate had ever experienced, and she found herself treasuring each ordinary moment. Helping Sophie practice her spelling words while dinner cooked on the stove, braiding the little girl's hair while they watched cartoons on Saturday morning, reading bedtime stories when Daniel worked late, doing different voices for each character, the way she'd heard him do. But normal life Kate was learning came with complications her privileged upbringing hadn't prepared her for. Like the evening when Daniel's old truck finally gave up entirely, leaving him stranded at work with no way to get home. "The tow truck alone will cost more than the repairs," Daniel explained when he called from his supervisor's office. "And without a truck I can't get to job sites. I can't work." The desperation in his voice was carefully controlled for Sophie's benefit, but Kate heard the panic underneath. In her world, a broken vehicle was an inconvenience solved with a phone call to the family driver. Here it was a crisis that threatened their basic survival. "There has to be something we can do," Kate said, her mind already racing through possibilities. "What about a loan?" "A rental car." "My credit's shot from Sarah's medical bills," Daniel admitted quietly. "And rental cars cost more per day than I make." Kate wanted to fix this problem the way her family fixed everything, with money applied liberally until the obstacle disappeared. But she couldn't reveal her financial resources without destroying the careful trust they'd built. Instead, she offered what she could. "I know someone who runs a mechanic shop. A family friend. He might be able to work out a payment plan." It wasn't entirely a lie. The Harrison family did business with a high-end auto service company, though they specialized in luxury vehicles rather than 15-year-old pickup trucks. But Kate was resourceful, and desperation made her creative. The next day, while Sophie was at school and Daniel was catching a ride to work with his supervisor, Kate made a series of phone calls that would have impressed her father's business managers. She found a local mechanic willing to repair Daniel's truck, in exchange for what she claimed was a college work-study program that helped community members with automotive expenses. The paperwork was complex, and Kate had to use some of her father's contacts to create a believable financial structure. But by the end of the week, Daniel's truck was running better than it had in years. "I don't understand how your college program works," Daniel said. When he picked up the repaired vehicle, clearly suspicious of the generous terms. "They're trying to build connections between the school and the local community," Kate explained. "You're helping them as much as they're helping you." Daniel wanted to believe her explanation, but Kate could see the questions in his eyes. Her stories were getting more elaborate, her cover identity more complex, and the gap between her claimed circumstances and her actual capabilities was growing harder to hide. That evening, as they sat down to dinner together, Sophie made an announcement that stopped Kate's heart. "I told Mrs. Johnson all about Kate today. She said she'd like to meet my new big sister at the parent-teacher conference next week." Daniel set down his fork, his expression carefully neutral. "Sophie, Kate isn't actually your sister. She's our tenant. She has her own life, her own family." "But she lives here," Sophie protested. "And she helps me with homework and reads me stories and makes me feel better when I'm sad. That sounds like family to me." Kate felt tears threatening as she looked at this little girl who had accepted her presence with such open-hearted generosity. Sophie had lost her mother, lived with financial insecurity, faced challenges that no 7-year-old should have to navigate. But instead of becoming withdrawn or bitter, she'd maintained a capacity for love that humbled everyone around her. "Maybe Kate has other obligations," Daniel said gently, clearly trying to manage his daughter's expectations without crushing her feelings. "Actually," Kate said, surprising herself with the words, "I'd love to come to the conference, if that's okay with your dad." Daniel's eyes met hers across the small table, and Kate saw the moment when his careful boundaries shifted slightly. Whatever questions he had about her background, whatever concerns he harbored about her true motivations, his daughter's happiness carried more weight than his suspicions. "Okay," he said quietly. "If you want to be there, we'd like that." Sophie's joy was immediate and overwhelming. She launched herself from her chair into Kate's arms, hugging her with the fierce affection that only children could deliver without self-consciousness. "This is going to be the best conference ever," Sophie declared. "I can't wait to show you off." That night, as Kate helped Sophie with her bath and listened to her excited planning for the upcoming conference, she realized how deeply she'd become invested in this little girl's happiness. Sophie had become more than the daughter of her landlord. She'd become family in a way that had nothing to do with blood relationships or legal documents. The thought should have terrified her. Her father was still making increasingly threatening calls, her absence from the Harrison estate was becoming impossible to explain, and her carefully constructed cover story was showing strain. But as Sophie drifted off to sleep with her favorite stuffed rabbit and a smile on her face, Kate realized that some things were worth the risk. Some families were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in this small house where love mattered more than money, Kate felt like she'd found something her father's billions could never buy, a place where she belonged. A month into Kate's stay at the Matthews house, the careful boundaries everyone had established began to blur in ways that no one had anticipated. What started as a practical rental arrangement had evolved into something deeper, more complex, and infinitely more dangerous to everyone's carefully guarded hearts. Kate found herself looking forward to the sound of Daniel's truck in the driveway each evening, the way his tired face brightened when he saw her and Sophie curled up together on the couch. She'd catch herself listening for his quiet movements as he checked on Sophie before going to bed, the gentle way he whispered goodnight to his daughter, the weight of his footsteps, as he finally allowed himself to rest. Daniel, for his part, had stopped treating Kate like a temporary presence in their lives. He asked her opinion about Sophie's school projects, included her in decisions about weekend activities, and found excuses to linger in the kitchen during their increasingly frequent conversations. The way he looked at her had changed to less cautious assessment, and more something that made Kate's pulse quicken whenever she caught him watching her. Daddy smiles more when Kate's home, Sophie observed with the devastating honesty only 7-year-olds possessed, making both adults freeze over their Saturday morning pancakes. Sophie, that's not Daniel, started to protest, but his daughter was already moving on to more pressing concerns about whether they could add chocolate chips to the next batch. Kate felt heat rise in her cheeks as she busied herself with syrup distribution, hyper-aware of Daniel's presence across the small kitchen. When had the space between them started feeling electric? When had accidental touches become moments that lingered longer than necessary? The answer came to her during an innocent flour fight that erupted while they attempted to make homemade pizza for dinner. Sophie had accidentally spilled flour across the counter, which led to playful accusations about who was responsible for the mess. Before anyone quite knew how it happened, all three of them were dusted with white powder, laughing until their sides ached. Kate tried to wipe flour from Sophie's cheek and ended up with more on her own face. Daniel reached over to help his thumb gentle against her skin as he brushed away the evidence of their kitchen catastrophe. The touch lasted maybe 3 seconds, but Kate felt it like an electric shock that traveled from her face straight to her heart. Their eyes met over Sophie's head, and Kate saw her own confused feelings reflected in Daniel's expression. Warmth, and the terrifying recognition that they were crossing into territory that could change everything. "All clean," Daniel said quietly, his hand falling away slowly, reluctantly. Kate couldn't trust her voice to respond, so she focused on Sophie's continued giggling and the suddenly urgent need to clean flour from every surface in the kitchen. That night, as Kate helped Sophie into her pajamas and listened to her excited recap of their cooking adventure, she realized how naturally they'd fallen into family routines. Sophie automatically assumed Kate would be there for bedtime stories, included her in plans for the next day's activities, and had started calling her Kate Mom in a voice too quiet for Daniel to hear. "Can I tell you a secret?" Sophie whispered, as Kate tucked her favorite blanket around her small shoulders. "Of course, sweetheart. I pretend sometimes that you're my real mum. Not that I don't love my first mum, but she's in heaven and you're here. And you smell like cookies, and you don't get mad when I ask too many questions, and you make Daddy laugh like he used to before Mom got sick." Kate's throat closed completely. She pulled Sophie into a hug that was probably too tight, too desperate, too revealing of the emotions she'd been fighting since the moment she'd walked into this house. "I love you too, baby girl," she whispered against Sophie's hair. "So much. Do you think you'll stay forever?" The question hung in the air like a prayer Kate didn't know how to answer. Forever was a concept that didn't exist in her carefully controlled world of arranged marriages and business mergers. But looking into Sophie's hopeful eyes, Kate wanted to promise forever, even though she had no idea how to make such a promise real. "I'm here now," she said carefully. "That's what matters." After Sophie fell asleep, Kate found Daniel on the back porch nursing a beer and staring at the neighbor's garden with the kind of focus that suggested his mind was elsewhere entirely. "Penny, for your thoughts," Kate offered, settling into the plastic chair beside him. "Just thinking about how much things have changed since you got here," Daniel admitted. "Sophie's happier, more confident. She talks about you like you're a permanent part of her life." The words carried weight that Kate wasn't sure how to interpret. Was he warning her not to get too attached? Expressing his own conflicted feelings about their situation? Testing her commitment to staying? "She's an amazing kid. You've done an incredible job raising her. It hasn't been easy, Daniel said quietly. Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water, working enough to pay bills but missing things that matter. School events, bedtime stories, Saturday morning cartoons. I keep wondering if she'd be better off with someone who could give her more. Kate turned to study his profile in the porch light, noting the exhaustion that lived permanently in his shoulders, the worry lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights spent calculating bills and wondering if love was enough. Daniel, look at me. He turned, and Kate saw vulnerability in his expression that he probably didn't even realize he was showing. Sophie doesn't need more money or bigger toys or fancier clothes. She needs exactly what you give her every single day. Love, security, patience, and the absolute certainty that she's the most important thing in your world. That's everything that matters. Is it enough, though? The question came out raw, like he'd been carrying it alone for too long. It's more than enough. It's everything. The intensity of the moment settled between them like a third presence on the small porch. Kate became hyper-aware of how close they were sitting, the way the autumn air carried the scent of Daniel's soap, the fact that they were alone in a way they rarely were with Sophie as their constant buffer. Kate, Daniel said softly, and something in his voice made her breath catch. Yeah, I need you to know that this arrangement having you here, it's not just about the rent money anymore. Sophie adores you and I. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. I've come to care about you too, more than I probably should given our situation. Kate's heart hammered against her ribs. Daniel, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I just needed you to know. Sophie isn't the only one who's grown attached. The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and absolutely terrifying. Kate wanted to respond with equal honesty to tell him that she'd never felt as at home anywhere as she did in his kitchen, that she'd never loved anyone the way she loved his daughter, that she was falling for him in ways that had nothing to do with his handsome face and everything to do with his generous heart. Instead, she reached for his hand, their fingers interlacing naturally in the darkness. I care about you too, she whispered. Both of you. More than I ever expected to. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, both of them aware they were balanced on the edge of something that could either complete their makeshift family or destroy the fragile peace they'd built together. Inside the house, Sophie slept peacefully, dreaming of cookie-scented hugs and forever promises. On the porch, two adults who'd been broken by different kinds of loss allowed themselves to imagine what healing might look like when it came wrapped in flower fights and bedtime stories and the dangerous possibility of second chances. Saturday mornings had become sacred in the Matthews household, and Kate found herself treasuring the slow, easy rhythm that began with Sophie padding downstairs in her mismatched pajamas and ended with all three of them sprawled across the living room floor, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of family life. This particular Saturday started with Sophie's announcement that she wanted to make the most enormous pancakes in the history of breakfast, and ended with Kate learning that Daniel made perfect coffee and sang off-key while he cooked. You're terrible, Kate laughed, as Daniel's rendition of some classic rock song hit notes that didn't exist in nature. I'm enthusiastic, Daniel corrected, flipping a pancake that was indeed enormous. There's a difference. Sophie giggled from her perch on the counter where she was supposedly helping, but mostly stealing chocolate chips from the bag. Daddy's singing makes the pancakes taste better. It's science. Kate doubted the scientific validity of Sophie's theory, but she couldn't argue with the results. Everything tasted better in this kitchen, surrounded by easy laughter and the kind of domestic harmony she'd never experienced in her father's perfectly orchestrated household. My turn to help, Kate announced, moving to stand beside Daniel at the stove. The space was small enough that they bumped elbows, creating a closeness that felt both accidental and entirely natural. You're going to mess up my system, Daniel protested, but he was smiling as I guided her hands through the proper pancake flipping technique. Like this, Kate asked, attempting the wrist motion he'd demonstrated. Perfect. You're a natural. The praise was simple, probably meaningless, but it filled Kate with pride that was completely disproportionate to the accomplishment of successfully flipping a pancake. When had small victories started mattering so much? When had ordinary moments begun feeling extraordinary? After breakfast, Sophie insisted on teaching Kate how to braid hair the right way, which apparently involved techniques passed down from her mother through Daniel's admittedly limited styling abilities. Mommy used to do French braids that looked like princess hair. Sophie explained seriously, her small fingers working through Kate's long blonde strands. Daddy can do regular braids, but they're usually crooked. I can hear you, Daniel called from the kitchen where he was washing dishes with the efficiency of long practice. We know, Sophie called back sweetly. We're not being secretive. Kate closed her eyes as Sophie worked, marveling at the simple intimacy of having her hair touched with such careful attention. In her previous life, hairdressers had styled her hair with professional competence, but there was something profound about a 7-year-old's gentle hands creating tangles more than beauty, but offering love with every stroke. There, Sophie announced proudly. Now you look like a princess who's been riding horses all day. Kate examined her reflection in the hallway mirror, noting that her hair did indeed look like she'd been engaged in vigorous outdoor activity. It's perfect, she declared seriously. Very windswept and adventurous. Sophie beamed with pride, and Kate realized this was what unconditional acceptance felt like. Sophie didn't care if the braid was crooked or if Kate's hair stuck out at odd angles. The effort was what mattered, the time spent together, the simple act of caring expressed through inexpert fingers working with patient concentration. That afternoon brought an unexpected adventure when Daniel suggested they visit the local farmer's market, claiming that Sophie needed to learn about fresh vegetables and Kate needed to experience real apple cider to complete her education. The market was a revelation of sights, sounds, and smells that Kate's sheltered upbringing hadn't prepared her for. Vendors called out prices for seasonal produce. Children ran between booths with sticky hands and happy faces, and the air was filled with the scent of kettle corn and apple fritters. Try this, Daniel said, offering Kate a sample of honey from a local beekeeper. The sweetness burst across her tongue, complex and rich in ways that bore no resemblance to the processed sugar that had flavored her carefully controlled meals. It's incredible. Right, Sophie's been obsessed with honey ever since we started coming here. She wants to be a beekeeper when she grows up. Last week it was a veterinarian, before that a chef. I can barely keep up with her career aspirations. Kate watched Sophie chatting earnestly with the honey vendor about bee behavior, her questions serious and her attention complete. There was something beautiful about a child who believed she could be anything, who approached the world with curiosity rather than limitations. They bought apples, honey, fresh bread that was still warm from the oven, and vegetables that Sophie selected based on their shapes rather than their nutritional value. Kate paid for everything while Daniel was distracted by Sophie's discovery of a booth selling handmade jewelry, claiming the purchases were her contribution to household groceries. You don't have to do that, Daniel protested when he realized what she'd done. I want to. Besides, Sophie picked out enough vegetables to feed an army. I should contribute to the Sophie shopping experience. The truth was that Kate loved being able to provide for them, in small ways to contribute to the family economy, without revealing the vast resources that would change everything if discovered. Buying groceries felt like playing house, like pretending she belonged in their world of careful budgets and practical decisions. Walking home with arms full of farmers' market treasures, Kate found herself between Daniel and Sophie, naturally falling into step with their casual pace. Sophie chatted about the beekeeper's explanations, while Daniel pointed out neighbors' gardens and shared stories about the neighborhood's history. Mrs. Patterson grows the best roses in the county, Daniel explained, as they passed a house with an impressive front garden. She's been trying to teach me her secrets, but I kill every plant I touch. Daddy's really bad with flowers, Sophie confirmed. but he's good at fixing things and making pancakes and reading stories in funny voices. Kate smiled at the easy affection in Sophie's voice, the way she celebrated her father's strengths without judgment about his limitations. This was what family loyalty looked like, she realized. Not the calculated alliances of her father's world, but the simple acceptance of people's full humanity. That evening, as they prepared dinner with their farmer's market bounty, Kate experienced a moment of such perfect contentment that it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Sophie stood on her step-stool carefully washing apples while providing running commentary about proper fruit hygiene. Daniel moved around the small kitchen with easy efficiency, seasoning vegetables and sharing stories about his own childhood trips to farmers' markets with his grandmother. Kate found herself in the middle of it all, contributing to the meal preparation while absorbing the easy intimacy of family life. No one was performing for cameras or maintaining appropriate appearances. They were just three people who cared about each other, sharing food and stories, and the simple pleasure of time spent together. "This is really good," Sophie announced around a mouthful of roasted vegetables that she'd previously claimed to hate. "It tastes better when you help pick it out," Daniel observed. "Food always tastes better when you're part of the process." Kate thought about the elaborate meals served in her father's dining room, prepared by professional chefs and served by silent staff. The food had been exquisite, perfectly prepared and beautifully presented. But none of it had tasted as good as vegetables roasted in a slightly dented pan by a construction worker who measured seasonings by instinct rather than precision. As they cleaned up together, moving around each other in the small kitchen with the easy choreography of practice, Kate realized this was the moment she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not the dramatic rescue or the grand gesture, but the quiet, everyday magic of belonging somewhere, of being valued for who she was, rather than who she might become. "Thank you," she said quietly to Daniel as they finished the dishes. "For what?" "For this. For including me. For making me feel like family." Daniel dried his hands slowly, studying her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Kate, you know that's what you are, right, family? Sophie adores you, and I—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I can't imagine our lives without you anymore." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, and absolutely perfect in its simplicity. Kate felt her heart expand with a happiness so complete it was almost frightening. "I love you both too," she whispered, "more than I ever thought possible." From the living room came the sound of Sophie's laughter as she played with her favorite stuffed rabbit, creating elaborate adventures that only 7-year-olds could imagine. Outside evening settled over their quiet neighborhood like a comfortable blanket. In the kitchen, two adults who'd found healing in unexpected places allowed themselves to believe that love really could conquer the practical complications that threatened their fragile happiness. The first real crack in Kate's carefully constructed story appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when Sophie discovered her designer purse buried beneath textbooks in Kate's room. "This is so pretty," Sophie announced, having wandered upstairs while Kate was helping with homework. The little girl held the handbag with reverent fingers, stroking the buttery leather that had cost more than Daniel made in 2 weeks. Kate's blood went cold. The purse was an impulse purchase from her previous life, bought during a shopping trip with her father's assistant and forgotten in her rush to pack. Now it sat in Sophie's innocent hands like evidence of a crime she'd been trying to hide. "Where did you get this?" Sophie asked, with the natural curiosity of a child who'd never seen anything so expensive in her own home. "It feels like the purses the rich ladies carry on TV." It was a gift, Kate managed, her voice sounding strange, even to her own ears. "From a relative." Sophie accepted this explanation with the trust she offered all adults, but Kate could see questions forming behind her bright eyes. Questions about relatives who could afford gifts that looked like they belonged in store windows rather than student apartments. The incident might have passed without notice if Daniel's construction friend hadn't mentioned seeing Kate at Giovanni's 2 weeks earlier. The comment came during dinner conversation, casual and innocent, but it hit Kate like a physical blow. "Funny thing happened today," Mike Rodriguez said when Daniel recounted his workday. "I could have sworn I saw your tenant at Giovanni's last month, before she moved in with you guys. Looked just like her anyway. Pretty blonde girl, but she was with some guy in a suit that probably cost more than my truck." Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Must have been someone else. Kate's been looking for affordable housing for months." Mike shrugged. "Yeah, probably just a resemblance. But man, this girl was decked out. Designer everything, looked like she stepped off a magazine cover. Weird how people can look so similar sometimes." The conversation moved on, but Kate felt Daniel's eyes on her throughout the rest of the meal. She'd been at Giovanni's that night celebrating what she'd thought was her last dinner before escaping to college housing. She'd worn designer clothes because that's all she owned, and the guy in a suit had been her father's assistant, briefing her on charity commitments she was expected to fulfill. After Sophie went to bed, Daniel approached the subject with the directness that Kate had come to expect from him. "Want to tell me about Giovanni's?" Kate's carefully prepared explanations crumbled under the weight of his steady gaze. "I can explain. I'm sure you can. You've been explaining a lot of things lately. Mysterious college programs that pay for truck repairs, student discounts that cover grocery bills, family friends who can solve any problem with a phone call." The accumulated weight of her deceptions hung in the air between them. Kate realized that Daniel had been cataloguing inconsistencies for weeks, probably hoping for a reasonable explanation that would make sense of the gaps in her story. "It's complicated," she said weakly. "Try me. I'm pretty good with complicated." But before Kate could begin to untangle the web of half-truths she'd created, her phone rang with her father's personal number. The ringtone she'd never changed, a classical piece that marked it immediately as different from any call a college student might receive. Kate declined the call quickly, but not before Daniel noticed the name on the screen, William Harrison. Harrison, Daniel repeated slowly. As in Harrison Industries. The real estate company. Kate felt the last of her defenses crumble. There was no explanation that could make William Harrison's personal phone calls consistent with the identity she'd created. "Daniel, please let me explain. You're his daughter." The words came out flat, emotionless, the tone of someone processing a betrayal too large to fully comprehend. "You're Catherine Harrison, the billionaire's daughter, who was all over the society pages last year." Kate had forgotten about the society coverage of her engagement. That wasn't the speculation about her future marriage to James Morrison Jr. that had filled gossip columns for months. To most people she was invisible, but to someone who paid attention to local news, her face would be recognizable. "Yes," she whispered, unable to maintain the lie any longer. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, and Kate watched as understanding, hurt, and anger cycled through his expression. "You've been lying to me for weeks, living in my house, eating at my table, caring for my daughter, and it's all been some kind of game to you. No, that's not. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Daniel's voice was quiet, but Kate could hear the fury underneath. "Sophie adores you. She's planning a future that includes you. She calls you her big sister, for God's sake. And this whole time you've been playing house with our real life." The accusation hit harder than a physical blow. Kate felt tears burning her eyes as she tried to find words that could bridge the gap between her deception and the genuine love she felt for his family. "My feelings are real. Everything I feel for Sophie, for you, that's not fake. That's the most real thing in my life. How am I supposed to believe that when everything else has been a lie?" Kate didn't have an answer. Every explanation sounded hollow against the weight of his disappointment, the realization that she'd built their relationship on a foundation of deception. "I need you to leave," Daniel said quietly. "Tonight. Please let me talk to Sophie now." The word came out sharp, final. "You've done enough damage. Sophie doesn't need to hear that the person she's come to love has been lying to her from the beginning." Kate felt her world cracking apart with the efficiency of a controlled demolition. In one conversation, she'd lost everything that mattered: Daniel's trust, Sophie's innocent love, the first real home she'd ever known. As she packed her belongings with shaking hands, Kate could hear Sophie's voice from her bedroom, talking to her stuffed rabbit about the planned weekend activities that would never happen. The little girl had no idea that the woman she'd accepted as family was disappearing from her life as suddenly as she'd appeared. Kate left a letter on Sophie's pillow, trying to explain the unexplainable to a 7-year-old who believed in happy endings and forever families. Then she walked out of the Matthews house carrying everything she'd brought and leaving behind everything that mattered. Daniel watched from the window as she loaded her suitcase into a taxi, his expression unreadable. Kate looked back once, hoping for some sign of forgiveness or understanding, but he was already turning away. As the taxi pulled away from the small house that had become her sanctuary, Kate realized that running from her father's world had led her to the one thing she'd never expected to find: a love so complete that losing it felt like losing herself. Now she was homeless again, but this time the loss felt infinitely more devastating than any mansion could compensate for. Kate spent her first night away from the Matthews house in a hotel room that cost more per night than Daniel made in a week. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could afford luxury that most people could only dream of, but she'd never felt more bereft, more completely alone. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from her father's staff messages that grew increasingly urgent as her continued absence became impossible to explain to his business associates. But Kate ignored them all, lying on Egyptian cotton sheets that felt cold against her skin, staring at the ceiling and remembering the warmth of Sophie's small hand in hers. By morning, she'd made a decision that probably should have required more thought, but felt as natural as breathing. She was going to fight for the family she'd found, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. Kate returned to the Matthews house at noon, when she knew Daniel would be at work and Sophie would be at school. She wasn't ready to face either of them yet, but there were things she needed to collect, conversations that needed to happen, and apologies that couldn't wait any longer. She let herself in with the key Daniel hadn't thought to ask for back, moving through the small rooms that still smelled like home, despite everything that had changed. In the kitchen, Sophie's latest art project was stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, a drawing of 3 figures holding hands in front of a house with an enormous sun overhead. The drawing was labeled in careful 7-year-old handwriting, "My family." 3 figures: a tall one labeled Daddy, a small one labeled Me, and a medium-sized one with yellow hair labeled Kate Mom. Kate stared at the drawing until her vision blurred with tears. This was what she'd destroyed with her deception. Not just her own happiness, but Sophie's innocent faith in the permanence of love, the little girl's belief that families could be built by choice and sustained by care. She was still standing there when Daniel's truck pulled into the driveway 3 hours early. Kate heard his footsteps on the porch, the familiar sound of his key in the lock, and knew that hiding was no longer an option. Daniel stopped in the doorway when he saw her, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been relief before settling on careful neutrality. "You came back." "I never really left," Kate said quietly. "This is where I belong, Daniel, with you and Sophie. I know I lied about who I was, but I never lied about what I feel. Feelings don't erase deception. Sophie's been crying since yesterday. She doesn't understand why you disappeared without saying goodbye. She thinks she did something wrong." The words hit Kate like physical blows. She'd been so focused on her own pain, her own loss, that she hadn't fully considered the impact on Sophie's tender heart. "Let me talk to her, please. Let me explain." "Explain what?" "That you're the daughter of a billionaire who's been slumming it with the working class, that everything she believed about you was a performance." Kate flinched at the harsh words, but she recognized the hurt underneath Daniel's anger. She'd betrayed his trust in the most fundamental way possible, and no explanation could minimize that damage. "I was never performing," she said steadily. "Every moment I spent with Sophie was real. Every conversation we had, every bedtime story, every homework session. That was me, Daniel. The real me. Not the version my father created, not the society princess everyone expects me to be. Just me." Daniel studied her face clearly, wanting to believe but unable to get past the mountain of deception that stood between them. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why did you come here?" "Why us?" Kate took a shaking breath. This was the moment where honesty mattered more than self-preservation, where the truth had to be complete regardless of the consequences. "Because I was suffocating in my father's world. Because he'd arranged my entire life, including my marriage, without ever asking what I wanted. Because I saw your notice on that bulletin board, and something about the honesty in your handwriting made me believe that somewhere someone was offering shelter without conditions attached." She stepped closer, desperate for him to understand. "I didn't come here to deceive you. I came here to find out who I could be if I wasn't William Harrison's daughter. And what I found was that I could be someone who loves a 7-year-old girl more than her own safety. Someone who falls asleep listening to the sound of a man reading bedtime stories. Someone who would rather wash dishes in a small kitchen than eat gourmet meals in an empty mansion." Daniel's expression softened slightly, but Kate could see the walls he was rebuilding, the protective distance he was creating between them. "Kate, even if I could forgive the lying, even if I could trust you again, we live in different worlds. You're heir to a billion-dollar empire. I'm a construction worker who barely makes ends meet. Sophie and I can't compete with that kind of life. You're not competing with anything," Kate said fiercely. "Don't you understand? I chose this life over that one. I chose you and Sophie over everything my father could offer, for now. But what happens when the novelty wears off? When you miss the comfort and security of your real world? Sophie's already attached to you in ways that could destroy her if you decide to leave." Kate heard the fear underneath his practical concerns, the terror of a man who'd already lost one woman he loved and couldn't bear to watch his daughter experience that kind of abandonment. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. "But I can't prove that to you with words. I can only prove it by staying, by choosing you and Sophie every day for as long as you'll let me." They stood in the small kitchen where they'd shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many ordinary moments that had added up to something extraordinary. Kate could see Daniel wavering his love for her, battling with his need to protect Sophie from future heartbreak. Before either of them could speak again, the front door burst open with the force of Sophie's return from school. The little girl froze in the doorway when she saw Kate, her school backpack sliding off her shoulder to hit the floor with a thud. Kate Sophie's voice was small, uncertain, colored by the confusion and hurt of the past 24 hours. Kate knelt down to Sophie's eye level, her heart breaking at the careful distance in the little girl's posture. "Hi, baby girl. Daddy said you had to go away. He said grown-ups sometimes have to leave even when they don't want to." The careful explanation was clearly Daniel's attempt to protect his daughter from the complexity of adult emotions and betrayals. Kate felt a surge of gratitude for his gentleness, even in the midst of his own pain. "Sophie, I need to tell you something important, and I need you to listen carefully." "Okay?" Sophie nodded solemnly, and Kate took a breath that felt like it contained her entire future. "I haven't been completely honest about who I am. My family has a lot more money than I told you about, but everything else, everything that matters, has been true. I love you. I love your daddy. And I love being part of your family more than anything else in the world." Sophie processed this information with the gravity it deserved. "So you're rich like the people on TV? Something like that. But you still like our pancakes better than fancy food." Kate smiled through her tears. "I like everything about this life better than my old life." "Then why did you leave?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Kate glanced at Daniel, who was watching their interaction with an expression she couldn't read. "Because your daddy was hurt that I hadn't told him the truth from the beginning. And he was right to be hurt. I should have been honest with both of you." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. Then she walked over to Kate and climbed into her lap, wrapping her small arms around Kate's neck with the fierce affection that had become as necessary as breathing. "I missed you," Sophie whispered against Kate's hair. "I missed you too, sweetheart. So much." Over Sophie's head, Kate met Daniel's eyes, seeing the exact moment when his careful defenses began to crack. Whatever anger he felt toward Kate, whatever questions remained about their future, he couldn't deny the genuine love between his daughter and this woman who'd walked into their lives and changed everything. The sound of Sophie's contented sigh as she settled more firmly in Kate's arms filled the small kitchen with possibility. Sometimes Kate realized the most powerful arguments were the ones that didn't need words at all. The conversation that would determine their future began that evening after Sophie had gone to bed, her innocent joy at Kate's return, providing a temporary buffer against the complicated reality they still needed to navigate. Daniel and Kate sat at the kitchen table, where they'd shared so many meals, the space between them feeling simultaneously intimate and vast. "I need to know everything," Daniel said quietly. "No more half-truths or convenient explanations. If there's any chance of moving forward, I need to understand who you really are." Kate nodded, recognizing that this might be her only opportunity to bridge the gap her deceptions had created. She took a breath and began with the truth she'd never shared with anyone. "My name is Catherine Elizabeth Harrison. I'm the only child of William Harrison, who owns Harrison Industries, Harrison Properties, and about 12 other companies I can't keep track of. My mother died when I was 3, and I was raised by a succession of nannies, tutors, and boarding schools while my father built his empire." Daniel listened without interruption, his expression carefully neutral, as Kate painted a picture of a childhood that was privileged in every material way and empty of the emotional connections he'd provided naturally for Sophie. "I've never had a real friendship that wasn't influenced by my father's wealth or business connections. I've never made a decision about my own life that wasn't filtered through the impact it might have on the family company. Until I was 18, I had bodyguards who followed me to classes. I've never been grocery shopping alone, never taken public transportation, never had a conversation that wasn't monitored by someone on my father's payroll." Kate's voice grew steadier as she continued finding relief in finally sharing the isolation she'd carried for so long. 3 months ago, my father informed me that he'd been negotiating my engagement to James Morrison Jr., the son of his business partner. Not discussing it with me, not asking my opinion, just arranging my marriage like a corporate merger. The wedding was scheduled for this December, with or without my consent. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, understanding beginning to replace suspicion. The world Kate was describing was so foreign to his own experience that he couldn't have imagined it if she hadn't laid it out in such careful detail. That's when I realized that if I didn't leave, I was going to spend the rest of my life being a beautifully dressed puppet in someone else's production. So I walked away from everything. The mansion, the trust funds, the security detail, all of it. I wanted to find out who I could be if I wasn't William Harrison's daughter. Kate met his eyes directly, needing him to see the truth in her words. And what I discovered was that I could be someone who loves making pancakes on Saturday morning more than attending charity galas. Someone who would rather read bedtime stories than make small talk at business dinners. Someone who falls asleep listening to the sounds of a real family instead of rattling around in an empty mansion with 27 rooms. Kate Daniel said softly, and she heard something in his voice that hadn't been there since her deception was revealed. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. I know I handled this badly. I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning. But I was terrified that if you knew who my father was, you'd see me as a charity case or a spoiled rich girl playing at real life. I was terrified that you'd treat me differently, and being treated normally was the only thing I'd ever wanted. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing information that challenged everything he'd assumed about her motivations and character. "Your father," he said finally. "He doesn't know where you are." Kate's phone buzzed on the table between them, as if summoned by Daniel's question. William Harrison's name appeared on the screen, along with a text message that made Kate's blood run cold. "Catherine, you have until midnight to return home voluntarily. After that, I'll take steps to collect you myself." Daniel read the message over her shoulder, his expression darkening. "Collect you, like your property. To him, I am property, a very expensive investment that he expects to yield returns in the form of business connections, strategic marriages, and enhanced social standing." The reality of Kate's situation settled over them both, like a weight neither had fully anticipated. This wasn't just about two people working through trust issues in their relationship. This was about a young woman who'd risked everything to claim her own life, and a father who saw her autonomy as theft of his assets. "He'll find me," Kate said quietly. "He has the resources to track down anyone, anywhere. Private investigators, security firms, contacts in every industry. It's not a matter of if, it's when." Daniel studied her face, seeing fear there, but also determination. "What happens when he does? He'll try to force me to return. He'll probably threaten to ruin anyone who's helped me use his influence to make life difficult for people who've shown me kindness." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. By staying here, by fighting for the life she'd built with Daniel and Sophie Kate, was potentially bringing her father's wrath down on the family she was trying to protect. "Maybe you should go back," Daniel said, though the words seemed to pain him. "Maybe fighting him isn't worth the risk to Sophie." Kate reached across the table and took his hands, noting the calluses earned through years of honest work, the strength that came from building things rather than tearing them down. "Daniel, in 20 years of life, I've never fought for anything that mattered. I've accepted every decision made for me, every plan arranged without my input, every future designed around other people's priorities. But I'm not accepting this." Her voice grew stronger, more certain. "I'm fighting for Sophie's bedtime stories and your terrible singing while you cook. I'm fighting for Saturday morning pancakes and homework help and the right to be part of a family that sees me as Kate instead of Catherine Harrison. I'm fighting for the first love I've ever felt with a man who judges me by my character rather than my bank account." Daniel's grip on her hands tightened. "Kate, I don't know if I can protect you from that kind of power, that kind of wealth. I'm not asking you to protect me from my father. I'm asking you to let me protect what we've built together." They sat in the quiet kitchen, holding hands across a table that had witnessed so many ordinary moments, both of them aware that the peaceful life they'd created was about to be tested in ways they couldn't fully anticipate. Outside the neighborhood settled into evening quiet, unaware that one of its residents was preparing for a battle that would determine not just her own future, but the fate of the makeshift family that had become her whole world. William Harrison arrived at 7 o'clock the next morning with the subtlety of a military operation. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the modest neighborhood, their tinted windows and pristine paint jobs marking them as foreign intruders in a world of pickup trucks and economy cars. Kate woke to the sound of car doors slamming and immediately knew her grace period was over. She'd spent the night in her small upstairs room, having convinced Daniel to let her stay one more night while they figured out how to handle the inevitable confrontation with her father. From her window, Kate watched William Harrison emerge from the lead vehicle like a general surveying conquered territory. At 55, he commanded attention without effort, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, his charcoal suit unmarked by wrinkles or uncertainty. Behind him followed 2 men in matching dark suits who were clearly security rather than business associates. Neighbors emerged from their houses to stare at the spectacle. Mrs. Chen from next door held her coffee mug with both hands, watching the proceedings with the fascination of someone witnessing an event that would fuel neighborhood conversations for months. Children on their way to school slowed their walking to gawk at the luxury vehicles that looked like movie props in their ordinary neighborhood. Downstairs, Kate heard Sophie's voice raised in excitement. "Daddy, there are fancy cars outside, like in the movies." Daniel's response was too quiet to hear, but Kate could imagine his tension as he realized their peaceful morning was about to explode into complications he'd never prepared for. The knock on the front door came with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Kate hurried downstairs to find Daniel standing protectively in front of Sophie, his hand on his daughter's shoulder, in a gesture that spoke of paternal instincts overriding everything else. "Stay behind me," Daniel said quietly to Sophie, who was clearly confused by the sudden tension in their household. Kate reached them just as Daniel opened the front door, revealing William Harrison in all his intimidating glory. Up close, her father's presence filled the small space with an energy that made even the comfortable living room feel cramped and inadequate. "Catherine." His voice carried the steel that had built an empire and the disappointment that had shaped her entire childhood. "You will pack your belongings immediately. We're leaving." The command was delivered as fact rather than request, the tone of a man who'd never been told no by someone whose opinion mattered. William's eyes swept the modest living room, taking in the worn furniture, the children's toys scattered across the carpet, the family photos that spoke of genuine affection rather than professional staging. Daniel stepped slightly forward, his body language protective, despite the obvious disparity in power and resources. "Mr. Harrison, this is my home. Kate is my tenant, and she's welcome to stay as long as she chooses." William's attention shifted to Daniel with the calculating assessment of a businessman evaluating a minor obstacle to be removed. His gaze traveled from Daniel's work clothes to his calloused hands to the small house that probably cost less than William's monthly wine budget. "Mr. William's tone made the question sound like a demand. "Matthews. Daniel Matthews. Mr. Matthews, my daughter is 20 years old and has responsibilities that require her immediate attention. Her continued presence here is inappropriate and potentially damaging to important business relationships." Sophie, who had been watching the interaction with the wide-eyed fascination of a 7-year-old, witnessing adult drama, chose that moment to assert herself. "Kate lives here with us," she announced with the confidence of someone who'd never learned that children weren't supposed to contradict intimidating adults. "She's part of our family now." William's expression shifted as he noticed Sophie, for the first time taking in her school clothes, her backpack ready for the day, her small hand wrapped trustingly around Daniel's arm. For just a moment, something flickered across his features that might have been recognition of innocence, but it was quickly replaced by his usual businesslike composure. "Young lady, this is an adult conversation that doesn't concern you," Sophie Daniel said gently. "Why don't you go finish getting ready for school?" But Sophie wasn't finished making her point. With the fearless honesty that only children possessed, she looked directly at William Harrison and delivered a statement that cut through his careful control. "Kate makes Daddy happy, and she reads me bedtime stories, and she helps with my math homework, and she loves us and we love her. If you take her away, you're going to make us all really sad." The simplicity of the declaration hung in the air like a challenge to everything William had assumed about his daughter's temporary rebellion. Here was a child who saw Catherine not as the Harrison heiress or a valuable business asset, but as someone essential to her family's happiness. Kate watched her father process Sophie's words, noting the way his jaw tightened as he realized this wasn't just about retrieving a wayward daughter. This was about 3 people who'd built genuine emotional connections that couldn't be dismissed as easily as business arrangements. "Catherine, you're coming home," William repeated, but some of the absolute certainty had gone out of his voice. "No, Dad. I'm not." Kate stepped closer to Daniel and Sophie, physically aligning herself with the family she'd chosen. "This is my home now. These are the people I love, and they love me. Not because of who my father is or what our family name represents, but because of who I am when I'm with them." William stared at his daughter, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in years. The Catherine he'd shaped and controlled would never have defied him so directly, would never have chosen a construction worker's modest home over the luxury and security he provided. "You're throwing your life away," he said, but the words lacked their usual commanding force. "These people can't give you the life you deserve, the opportunities you were born for." Daniel's voice was quiet but steady when he responded. "Mr. Harrison, with respect, maybe your daughter knows better than anyone what kind of life she deserves." The two men stared at each other across a gulf of experience and understanding that seemed impossible to bridge. William, who'd built his empire through calculation and control, facing Daniel, who'd built his family through love and sacrifice. In the space between them stood Kate, no longer the obedient daughter or the rebellious heiress, but a woman who'd finally found the courage to fight for her own happiness. The tension in Daniel's small living room was so thick it seemed to have physical weight. William Harrison stood near the front door like an uninvited storm system, his presence making everything else appear smaller, shabbier, inadequate. His security detail remained outside, but their watchful silhouettes were visible through the windows, adding an element of threat to what should have been a family conversation. Kate positioned herself deliberately between her father and the life she'd built. Her hands trembling slightly, but her voice steady. "Dad, I need you to understand something. I didn't leave home to hurt you or embarrass the family. I left because I was disappearing." William's expression remained carefully controlled, but Kate caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes. In his world, children who had everything handed to them didn't disappear. They expressed gratitude through compliance and loyalty through obedience. "You had everything," William said, his tone carrying the bewilderment of a man who'd never questioned whether everything money could buy was actually enough. Security, education, opportunities that most people can only dream of. A future planned and provided for before you were old enough to understand what you were being given. Sophie, who had been quietly observing this exchange with the intense focus she normally reserved for her favorite television shows, chose that moment to offer her perspective with devastating innocence. But she was lonely. Sophie announced, her small voice carrying through the room with surprising clarity. "Kate told me that rich people's houses are really big, but really quiet, and that nobody there knew her favorite color, or asked about her dreams, or cared if she was sad." The words hit William like a physical blow. Kate watched her father's composed mask slip for just a moment, revealing something that looked almost like pain before his business demeanor reasserted itself. Sophie Daniel said, gently recognizing that his daughter was innocently walking into emotional territory that adults were struggling to navigate. "It's okay, Daddy," Sophie said with 7-year-old wisdom. "I think Kate's dad just forgot that love is more important than fancy things. Sometimes grown-ups forget really important stuff." Kate felt tears burning her eyes at Sophie's simple summary of the complex dynamics that had shaped her entire life. This little girl who'd never known material wealth, but had been rich in affection from birth, understood something that had taken Kate 20 years to recognize. William stared at Sophie as if she were speaking a foreign language. In his experience, children were seen and not heard, educated by professionals, and raised by staff members who understood their place in the hierarchy. The idea of a 7-year-old offering philosophical insights about love and family was completely outside his frame of reference. Young Lady William began his tone, carrying the authority he used with business subordinates. "You don't understand the complexities of adult responsibilities. I understand that Kate cries sometimes when she thinks nobody's watching. Sophie replied with the devastating honesty that only children possessed. And I understand that she's not crying because she misses fancy things. She cries because she's scared you're going to make her leave us. The silence that followed Sophie's words was complete. Kate saw her father processing this information, recognizing perhaps for the first time that his daughter's departure hadn't been a childish tantrum, but a desperate escape from emotional suffocation. Daniel stepped slightly closer to Kate, his presence supportive without being possessive. "Mr. Harrison, your daughter has been part of our family for 2 months. I've watched her help Sophie with homework, cook dinner after spending all day at classes, worry about our grocery budget because she wanted to contribute rather than take advantage. She's not playing at being normal. This is who she really is when she's free to choose." William's attention shifted to Daniel with the sharp focus he normally reserved for business negotiations. "Mr. Matthews, I appreciate that Catherine has been helpful during her exploration of alternative living arrangements, but her responsibilities extend far beyond this household. She has commitments, obligations, a future that requires her presence and participation." Whose commitments, Kate asked, her voice stronger than it had been since her father arrived. "Whose obligations?" "Because I don't remember agreeing to any of them." William's jaw tightened. "Catherine, you are 20 years old and the heir to a business empire that employs thousands of people. Your marriage to James Morrison, Jr. will strengthen both companies, secure countless jobs, and position both families for long-term success. Your personal preferences are secondary to those responsibilities." Kate felt the familiar weight of duty and expectation pressing down on her, the same pressure that had shaped every decision of her life. But now, standing in Daniel's living room, with Sophie's small hand slipping trustingly into hers, the weight felt different, not inevitable, but optional, not destiny, but choice. "I never asked to inherit an empire," Kate said quietly. "I never agreed to marry James Morrison, Jr. I never consented to having my entire life planned around other people's business interests. And I'm not agreeing to any of it now." William stared at his daughter as if she'd announced her intention to become a circus performer. "Catherine, you're being childish. This rebellion will pass, and when it does, you'll realize what you've thrown away for a few months of playing house." Daniel's voice was carefully controlled when he responded, but Kate could hear the steel underneath. "Mr. Harrison, with all due respect, your daughter isn't playing anything. She's building a real life with real people who care about her happiness more than her usefulness." The two men faced each other across a gap that represented more than just different economic circumstances. William saw Daniel as an obstacle to be removed, a temporary distraction from his daughter's proper destiny. Daniel saw William as a man who'd never learned to value the things that actually mattered. "Mr. Matthews." William said, his tone shifting to the calculated politeness he used when closing difficult deals. "I think you and I should discuss this situation privately. Perhaps you'd be willing to consider compensation for the inconvenience my daughter has caused, along with assurances that your family's future needs will be adequately provided for." The offer hung in the air like a landmine. Kate felt her breath catch, suddenly terrified that her father's money might accomplish what his authority couldn't. Daniel had been struggling financially for months, working double shifts to keep his family afloat, making sacrifices that love couldn't quite cover. But Daniel's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying a dignity that no amount of money could buy or sell. "Mr. Harrison, your daughter isn't an inconvenience. She's family, and families aren't for sale." Kate's vision blurred with tears at the simple declaration. In her father's world, everything was for sale if you offered enough money. Loyalty, influence, even love could be purchased if you understood the right price point. But here in this small house where every dollar was carefully budgeted and every decision weighed against practical necessity, Daniel had just declared that some things were simply not available at any price. William stared at Daniel with the bewilderment of a man whose primary tool for solving problems had just been declared useless. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, money wasn't the answer to a challenge he faced. Catherine Williams said, finally turning back to his daughter with something that might have been desperation creeping into his controlled expression. These people can't protect you. They can't provide for you. They can't give you the life you were born to live. Kate looked around the small living room, where she'd found more happiness in 2 months than she'd experienced in 20 years of luxury and privilege. Sophie's art projects covered the refrigerator. Daniel's work boots sat by the front door, and family photos told the story of love that had survived loss and hardship, and grown stronger for the testing. "Dad," she said softly, "this is the life I was born to live. It just took me 20 years to find it." The words settled over the room like a benediction, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another that none of them could have anticipated when William Harrison's convoy first appeared in their quiet neighborhood. For 3 days after William Harrison's departure, the Matthews house felt like it was holding its breath. Kate had taken a room at a nearby hotel, giving Daniel space to process everything that had been revealed while maintaining enough distance to avoid forcing any decisions before they were ready to be made. The separation was agony for everyone involved. Sophie asked about Kate constantly, her questions growing more confused and heartbroken each time Daniel had to explain that sometimes grown-ups needed time to figure things out. Daniel threw himself into overtime work, but Kate could see the exhaustion in his eyes when they passed each other in the neighborhood grocery store, their brief encounters polite and careful and utterly devastating. Kate spent her days walking around the college campus where this entire journey had begun, trying to reconcile the young woman who'd been desperate enough to answer a stranger's room rental notice with the person she'd become in Daniel's small house. Her father called twice daily, offering increasingly elaborate bribes and threats in equal measure, but his words felt like they were coming from another planet. On Thursday evening, Kate received a call that changed everything. Kate, Sophie's small voice came through the phone like a lifeline. "Daddy said I could call you because I missed you too much." Kate's heart clenched at the careful way Sophie pronounced each word clearly, delivering a message she'd practiced. In the background, she could hear Daniel's quiet voice offering gentle corrections and encouragement. "I miss you too, baby girl. So much. Are you coming home soon?" Daddy made pancakes this morning, but they weren't the right shape, and nobody laughed at his singing, and the kitchen felt too quiet. Kate closed her eyes, picturing the small kitchen that had become the center of her world, imagining Daniel trying to maintain their family routines while dealing with his own confusion and hurt. "Can I talk to your dad for a minute? He's right here. He misses you too, but he tries to pretend he doesn't. Adults are weird sometimes." Daniel's voice came through the line, rough with emotions he was clearly trying to control. "Kate. Hi." The simple greeting carried the weight of everything they'd shared and everything they stood to lose. Kate could hear Daniel's careful breathing, the same rhythm he used when he was thinking through a complex problem at work. "Sophie asked if she could invite you to dinner tomorrow night," Daniel said carefully. It's been hard for her not understanding why you're not here anymore." "And what do you want?" Kate asked, needing to know if this invitation came from paternal duty or something deeper. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I want to try to figure this out. For all of us. Can you come by around 6? I'll be there." Friday arrived with the weight of a day that could determine everything or resolve nothing. Kate spent an hour deciding what to wear, finally settling on jeans and a simple sweater that belonged to her old life but felt appropriate for the conversation that lay ahead. She knocked on the front door of the house that had been her home for 2 months, her heart hammering as footsteps approached from inside. Daniel opened the door, and Kate's breath caught at how tired he looked. His usually bright eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, his shoulders carrying tension that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi yourself." Before either of them could say more, Sophie appeared behind her father like a small rocket, launching herself into Kate's arms with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting days for this reunion. "You came back, I knew you would. Daddy said maybe you wouldn't want to, but I knew you loved us too much to stay away forever." Kate held Sophie tightly, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the innocence that made everything else seem solvable. Over Sophie's head, her eyes met Daniel's, and she saw something there that looked like hope struggling against caution. Dinner was a careful dance around the topics that mattered most. Sophie chatted about school, her friends, a book she'd been reading about a girl who talked to horses. Daniel asked polite questions about Kate's week, her classes, the hotel where she'd been staying. But underneath the surface conversation, Kate could feel the real discussion waiting to happen. After Sophie went to bed, having extracted promises that Kate would still be there in the morning, Daniel and Kate found themselves back at the kitchen table, where so many important conversations had taken place. "I've been thinking," Daniel began, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug for warmth and comfort, "about what you said about fighting for this family, about choosing us over everything else your father could offer." Kate waited, afraid that interrupting might break whatever fragile thread was connecting them in this moment. "I was angry," Daniel continued, "not just about the lying, but about feeling like a fool, like I'd been naive to think that someone like you could really want someone like me." "Daniel, let me finish," he said gently. "I was scared, too. Scared that when the novelty wore off, when real life got hard or boring or frustrating, you'd remember what you could have instead and decide we weren't worth the sacrifice." Kate felt tears burning her eyes at the honesty in his words, the vulnerability he was offering despite everything that had gone wrong between them. "But Sophie helped me understand something," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger. "She asked me why I was mad at you for having rich parents when I wasn't mad at her for having a mum who died. She said that people can't help what families they're born into, but they can help what families they choose." The wisdom of a 7-year-old, delivered through her father's careful words, hit Kate with overwhelming force. Sophie had seen past the complexity of adult emotions to the simple truth underneath. Family was about choice, not circumstances. "I made mistakes," Kate said, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I should have trusted you to see past my father's money to who I really am, and I should have trusted what I saw in your actions instead of doubting your motives when I learned about your background," Daniel replied. "Kate, in the 2 months you lived here, you showed me and Sophie more genuine care than most people experience in a lifetime. That doesn't become fake just because your last name is Harrison." They reached for each other across the table simultaneously, their hands meeting in the middle, with the relief of people who'd been underwater too long finally breaking the surface. "I love you, Kate," said the words, tumbling out with all the honesty she'd been holding back. "I love Sophie like she was my own daughter. I love the man you are when you read bedtime stories in funny voices. I love the way you make pancakes that are never quite round and sing songs that are never quite on key. I love this life we built together, and I'm willing to fight anyone, including my father, to keep it." Daniel's grip on her hands tightened. "I love you too. I love the way you help Sophie with math homework without making her feel stupid. I love the way you sneak vegetables into her favorite foods so she eats properly. I love that you chose us when you could have chosen anything." They leaned across the small table and kissed, tentative at first, and then with the desperate relief of people who'd thought they'd lost everything and discovered they still had what mattered most. When they broke apart, both were crying and laughing simultaneously, overwhelmed by the possibility that love really could be stronger than the obstacles arrayed against it. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked. "Your father isn't going to give up." Kate thought about the constant phone calls, the threats and bribes, the pressure that would continue until she either returned home or found a way to permanently establish her independence. "Now I fight for us properly," she said, No more hiding, no more half-truths. I'm going to tell my father that I'm choosing this life permanently, and I'm going to make sure he understands that no amount of money or influence is going to change that decision." Daniel studied her face, seeing determination there, alongside the love that had never wavered despite everything they'd been through. "Are you sure? Once you do that, there's probably no going back." Kate smiled, thinking of Sophie asleep upstairs, trusting that the adults in her life would figure out how to keep their family together. Daniel. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. 6 weeks later, Kate Harrison legally became Kate Matthews in a ceremony that her father attended with the resigned acceptance of a man who'd finally recognized defeat. The wedding took place in Daniel and Kate's backyard, decorated with flowers from Mrs. Chen's garden, and filled with neighbors who'd watched their love story unfold with the invested interest of people who'd chosen to become family. Sophie served as maid of honor, wearing a lavender dress she'd picked out herself and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that she'd insisted looked more magical than the expensive arrangements Kate's former life would have required. During the ceremony, Sophie stood between Kate and Daniel, her small hands holding theirs as if physically binding them together into the family unit she'd believed in from the beginning. William Harrison sat in the front row beside Mike Rodriguez and other construction workers who'd become Daniel's chosen family over the years. The billionaire real estate developer looked slightly stunned to find himself at a backyard wedding where the decorations cost less than his typical lunch, but Kate caught him wiping away tears when Sophie declared that this was the best family day ever. The transformation in their relationship hadn't happened overnight. After Kate's firm refusal to return to her former life, William had tried several more approaches ranging from legal threats to financial incentives to elaborate guilt trips about her abandoned responsibilities. But Sophie's innocent questions about why grandparents couldn't just be happy that their children were happy had eventually worn down his resistance. Dad, Kate had said during one of their increasingly civil phone conversations, "You spent 20 years trying to build a life you thought I should want. What if instead you tried to understand the life I actually do want?" The process of understanding had been slow and sometimes painful, but William had gradually recognized that his daughter's rebellion wasn't temporary or superficial. She'd found something in Daniel's modest house that all his wealth couldn't replicate: genuine happiness based on mutual love rather than mutual benefit. Kate's new life bore little resemblance to her old one, and she treasured every difference. She'd gotten a job teaching art classes to children at the local community center, using skills her expensive education had provided to serve kids whose parents couldn't afford private lessons. The pay was modest, but watching 7-year-olds discover they could create beauty with their own hands was worth more than any trust fund dividend. Daniel had initially worried about Kate adjusting to a budget that required careful planning and occasional sacrifices, but she'd embraced the challenge with enthusiasm that surprised them both. She clipped coupons with the dedication of someone solving complex puzzles, comparison shopped for groceries like an accountant balancing spreadsheets, and found genuine satisfaction in making their household finances work through cooperation rather than unlimited resources. "Look," Kate announced one evening, proudly displaying their monthly budget that she'd managed to balance while setting aside money for Sophie's college fund. "We can afford to take Sophie to that science museum she's been wanting to visit." Daniel marveled at his wife's joy over financial accomplishments that most people would consider ordinary. But for Kate, every successful budget month represented proof that she could build a life based on planning and teamwork rather than endless resources and other people's management. Sophie thrived under the attention of 2 parents who were genuinely invested in her daily happiness. Daniel continued to handle morning routines and bedtime stories while Kate took over homework supervision and creative projects. Together they attended school events, soccer games, and art shows, with the proud dedication of parents who'd chosen each other as much as they'd chosen their daughter. The neighborhood had embraced Kate as completely as Sophie had from the beginning. Mrs. Chen taught her to garden sharing vegetables and advice with equal generosity. Other families included them in potluck dinners and backyard barbecues, accepting Kate as Daniel's wife rather than William Harrison's daughter. "I never knew community could feel like this," Kate confided to Daniel one evening as they watched Sophie play with neighborhood children in their front yard. "Growing up, our neighbors were business associates or social contacts, people who could help advance my father's interests rather than people who might need help with their groceries or babysitting." Daniel smiled, remembering his own childhood in a similar neighborhood where everyone looked out for everyone else's kids and borrowed tools freely without keeping complicated ledgers of who owed what to whom. "It's different when people choose to care about each other instead of being paid to," he agreed. The most challenging aspect of Kate's new life wasn't financial or social, but emotional, learning to accept love without earning it. Learning to trust that Daniel and Sophie's affection wasn't conditional on her performance or usefulness had required months of patient reassurance from both of them. "You know we love you when you burn dinner, right?" Sophie had asked one evening after Kate's attempt at a new recipe had resulted in a smoke detector symphony and takeout pizza. "You don't have to be perfect for us to want you here." Daniel had watched his wife's face during that conversation, seeing the exact moment when Sophie's innocent acceptance helped Kate understand that their family operated on principles of grace rather than merit. 3 months into their marriage, Kate discovered she was pregnant. The announcement came during their Saturday morning pancake ritual, with Sophie cheering so loudly that neighbors probably heard her 3 houses away. A baby, Sophie declared, already planning elaborate big sister activities. "I can teach it about books and dinosaurs and how to tell when Daddy's pancakes are actually round." Daniel's joy was quieter, but no less profound. Watching Kate place her hands over her still, flat stomach, with wonder and gratitude, he recognized the completion of their family circle in ways that went beyond biology or legal documents. "Are you happy?" Kate asked that evening as they lay in bed, her head on Daniel's chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had become her favorite sound. "I'm more than happy." Daniel set his hand gentle on her hair. "I'm home. We all are." Through the walls they could hear Sophie talking to her stuffed rabbit about all the things she planned to teach her new brother or sister, her excitement carrying clearly through the small house that had become the center of their universe. Outside, autumn was settling over their quiet neighborhood, promising the kind of winter that families spend together, creating memories that would last long after the snow melted. Inside, 3 people who'd chosen each other despite every practical reason not to, prepared for the expansion of a love that had already proven strong enough to survive anything the world could throw at them. Kate fell asleep listening to Sophie's planning session and Daniel's gentle breathing, surrounded by the sounds of real life, real family, and real happiness that no amount of money could have purchased, but that love had provided freely. 2 years after Kate first answered Daniel's simple room rental notice, their family had settled into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. The small house had been expanded slightly. William Harrison's wedding gift had been a contractor who'd added a nursery and updated the kitchen without changing the essential character that had drawn Kate home in the first place. Baby Emma Matthews was 6 months old, a cheerful infant with Daniel's dark eyes and Kate's determined chin, who seemed to find everything in her world endlessly fascinating. Sophie had embraced big sister duties with the enthusiasm she brought to every important project, appointing herself head of baby entertainment and protector of nap schedules. "Emma likes it when I read to her," Sophie announced during their Sunday morning family breakfast, bouncing the baby gently on her lap, while Kate finished preparing pancakes that had finally, after 2 years of practice, achieved something approaching circular. "She likes it when anyone pays attention to her," Daniel observed, reaching over to smooth baby hair that was sticking up at impossible angles. She's not particular about her audience. Kate smiled as she watched her family interact around their familiar kitchen table, marveling at how complete this life felt despite, or perhaps because, of its wonderful ordinariness. Emma babbled contentedly while Sophie provided running commentary on everything from the weather to her plans for teaching the baby to appreciate dinosaur documentaries. The neighborhood had expanded its embrace to include Emma with the same generosity they'd shown Kate. Mrs. Chen brought baby clothes her own grandchildren had outgrown, other families offered babysitting exchanges, and Sophie's friends treated Emma like a community mascot who belonged to everyone. William Harrison visited monthly, his initial awkwardness around domestic life gradually replaced by genuine engagement with his growing family. He'd learned to hold Emma properly, to listen to Sophie's elaborate storytelling with appropriate attention, and to appreciate Kate's happiness even when he couldn't entirely understand her choices. "She's getting big," William observed during his latest visit, watching Emma attempt to grab everything within reach with the determined focus of someone convinced the world was designed for her entertainment. "She's perfect," Sophie declared, with the absolute certainty that had characterized all her pronouncements about family members. "And when she's older, I'm going to teach her about books and art and how to make Daddy laugh when he's tired from work." Kate exchanged glances with Daniel over Sophie's head, both of them recognizing their daughter's generous spirit in her plans for her baby sister's education. Sophie had never shown an ounce of jealousy about sharing attention with Emma approaching big sister responsibilities with the same loving dedication she'd brought to accepting Kate into their family. "What about you, Dad?" Kate asked William, genuinely curious about his perspective on their expanding household. "Any thoughts on grandparent duties?" William considered the question seriously, watching Emma wave her small fists with the focused intensity she brought to all activities. "I was thinking about teaching her about business when she's older. Leadership principles, financial literacy, strategic thinking." Or, Sophie interjected helpfully, "You could teach her about hugs and bedtime stories and how to make people feel better when they're sad. That's more important than business stuff." William's expression softened as he looked at his older granddaughter, recognizing wisdom that his own business education had never provided. "You're absolutely right, Sophie. Those things are much more important." The transformation in William's priorities had been gradual but profound. Watching Kate's genuine happiness in her modest life had forced him to question assumptions he'd never examined. Sophie's innocent observations about love being more valuable than money had challenged worldviews he'd spent decades building. "I never thanked you properly," William said to Daniel that afternoon as they worked together in the backyard garden that Kate had started the previous spring. "For seeing what I missed in my daughter, for giving her the family she needed." Daniel paused in his weeding, studying his father-in-law with the careful attention he gave all important conversations. "She gave us just as much as we gave her. More probably. Sophie and I were barely surviving when Kate showed up. She didn't just join our family, she completed it." William nodded slowly, understanding finally that his daughter's choice hadn't been about rejecting her upbringing, but about finding the missing pieces of herself that wealth couldn't provide. That evening, as the extended family gathered for dinner around the table that had witnessed so many important conversations, Kate felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought them all together. Sophie chatted about her upcoming school science fair, while Emma contributed baby babbles from her high chair. Daniel and William discussed landscaping projects with the easy familiarity of men who'd learned to respect each other despite their vastly different backgrounds. "I have an announcement," Kate said, when the dinner conversation hit a natural pause. All attention turned to her, and Kate felt her heart expand with love for these faces that had become her whole world. "I got accepted into the graduate program for art therapy. Part-time so I can keep working with kids at the community center and still be home for family dinners and bedtime stories." Sophie's cheer was immediate and enthusiastic. That's so cool. You can help even more kids who are sad or scared or confused. Daniel's smile was proud and unsurprised. You'll be amazing at it. You already are amazing at it. William's expression held admiration, mixed with something that might have been regret for all the years he'd discouraged his daughter's artistic interests in favor of more practical pursuits. Congratulations, Catherine. Your mother would be very proud. It was the first time in years that William had mentioned Kate's mother without it being tied to family obligations or disappointed expectations. Kate felt tears threaten at the simple acknowledgement that her choices might honor her mother's memory rather than dishonor her father's plans. After dinner, as they cleaned up together with the easy efficiency of long practice, Kate found herself reflecting on the path that had led from a desperate room rental notice to this kitchen filled with love and laughter and the promise of continuing growth. Any regrets? Daniel asked quietly, noting her contemplative mood as they finished the dishes. Kate looked around their small kitchen, taking in Sophie's latest artwork on the refrigerator, Emma's high chair still decorated with evidence of her enthusiastic eating style, Daniel's work boots by the back door waiting for tomorrow's labor. Not one, she said honestly. This is exactly the life I was meant to live. It just took me 20 years to find the courage to claim it. Daniel pulled her close, and Kate melted into the embrace that had become her safest place in the world. Through the kitchen window, she could see William pushing Sophie on the swing set he'd installed as an early birthday gift. Both of them laughing as Sophie demanded to go. "Higher, higher, I love you, Daniel," said against her hair, the words carrying the weight of 2 years' worth of shared challenges, growth, and deepening commitment. "I love you too," Kate replied. "All of you. This whole beautiful, complicated, perfect family we built together." Emma's babbling drifted from the living room where she was having an animated conversation with her stuffed rabbit. Sophie's laughter rang out from the backyard, and Kate realized this was what forever looked like. Not a fairy tale ending, but a real beginning that would continue to unfold in kitchens and bedrooms and neighborhood streets for decades to come. Sometimes the richest life came from the simplest choices. Sometimes home wasn't a place, but a collection of people who chose to love each other every single day. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found both in a small house, where love mattered more than money and family was built by heart rather than blood. Friends, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you that real love sees past wealth and status to the heart beneath, please don't just watch and walk away. Hit that subscribe button and join our channel family for more stories that restore your faith in human connection. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that the most precious treasures aren't found in bank accounts, but in the hearts that open their doors to love. And remember, family isn't always about blood or circumstances. Sometimes it's about the courage to choose each other again and again until forever becomes as natural as breathing. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances exist, that love conquers all obstacles, and that sometimes the family we need finds us exactly when we need them most. Your support helps us bring more heartwarming stories like this one to families around the world. Until next time, keep believing that broken doesn't mean beyond repair, and that sometimes the best families are the ones we build ourselves one choice, one day, one heart at a time.